Would you pray with me? Holy God of every place and every time, take our minds and think with them, take our lips and speak with them, take our hands and work with them, take our feet and run with them, and take our hearts and set them on fire with love for you and all of creation. Amen. There was only one wall left to our crumbling snow fort, and only two of us remained in the skirmish. We probably only had about 10 snowballs left in our supply, and our neighborhood arch enemies were advancing with all get out. The infamous and dreaded McCarthy brothers. I'm sure you've heard of them. These older, bigger, and tall as trees brothers, there was probably 2 or 3 or 5 or like 20 of them, I think. They loomed before us, pummeling us with what seemed like a constant barrage of snow and ice balls. And only my 8-year-old-ish self and my best friend John remained, and we were about to get overwhelmed. And so, after a few nervous Hail Marys, or the Presbyterian equivalents, these were prayers, not Doug Fluties, I grabbed a few of the snowballs that remained and ran out from under cover toward them in a foolhardy mission. As John remained behind and yelled out, "Be brave, Robbie, be brave." Now, I may have been brave, but things got messy from there. And I don't think one snowball left my hands before the McCarthy brothers overwhelmed me. It was sort of a David and Goliath situation when David forgot to bring his slingshot. Now, were these older neighborhood bullies really my enemies? Or were they just people that we younger kids were scared of, mainly because we didn't know them? They lived on the other side of the neighborhood, a completely different world. They were different, they were older, I mentioned much taller than us. They were scarier. They were scarier, and so we dubbed them, of course, enemy. This morning we followed Jesus' lead and ponder enemies, people we're scared of. People who may hate us or distrust us, dislike our politics, or more deeply, perhaps because of what they have done to us or to others that we love, people who generate hate, trauma, or disgust within us. Jesus brings up this term, ekthros, in Greek, meaning hostile, adversary, or enemy, a few times in today's well-known reading from Luke chapter 6, so well read this morning by David. But I say to you, listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. And before we consider this more deeply, let's recall some context. Directly before these verses, Jesus calls the first 12 disciples from a place of prayer high up in the mountain. And then the very first line of our reading, which could benefit from an entire sermon unto itself, Jesus came down with them. This is not the Sermon on the Mount as told in Matthew's Gospel. This is the so-called Sermon on the Level Plain. And it begins with Jesus descending to a place of humility, equality, radical solidarity on a level place with the people, not above them. And these people are from all over the place. Jews from Judea and Jerusalem, and Gentiles from the coastal towns of Sidon and Tyre. There are wild differences within this group. And there are no divisions in this gathering. There are no walls, there are no aliens or strangers. It is a place of radical equity where Jesus begins speaking about what the beloved community looks like, the kingdom of God. And it was from there that diseases were healed, troubles were let go of, and healing began as power emanated from this one Jesus who was with them in that level place. In that descendant solidarity, there is the reality of a broken world. There is disease, there is troubles, there are suffering that the power of Jesus is called to respond to. But out of the humility, the hummus, the earthiness of Jesus, it doesn't say this in the text, but Jesus must have been sitting down because the text then says he looks up at the followers and says, "Blessed are you who are poor. Blessed, holy, set apart, beloved are you who are poor, hungry, grief-stricken, hated, excluded, reviled. Rejoice, for the kingdom, the beloved community is yours. Here also are many sermons, a partial list of beatitudes, deeply good news for anyone who faced or faces such realities. But Jesus goes on from there. Woe to you who are rich, fed, laughing, and praised, for you've already received your consolation. Jesus begins the Sermon on the Plain by making it plain God has a preferential option for the poor, the disenfranchised, and everyone else, warnings and woes, beware. But to all, both the rich and the poor, who most certainly were gathered on that level place, to the Jew and to the Gentile, to a world of incredible diversity, leveled out in the eyes of Jesus, hear the teaching that continues. Love your enemies and do good to those who hate or abuse you. These are hard words. Hard words for us this morning. What words or images are conjured in your mind's eye as you hear this morning the word enemy? Take a moment, think about it. Enemy. What images come into your mind? Do they come quickly, or do they take some prodding? Do you picture your McCarthy brother bully neighborhood equivalent? Or the person who cut you off or did not hold the door for you on your way to church this morning? Or someone who gets under your skin? Or perhaps someone on the very opposite side of this super polarized political landscape? Or might you picture other countries? From someone who grew up in the era of the 1984 movie Red Dawn, where the Soviets invade into a sleepy U.S. town. Perhaps you think of the meddling Russian Empire or the so-called scary North Korean country. Perhaps your enemy is our own country, or the people who are supposed to be running it with compassion for all. For some of us, it's hard to picture an enemy. For others, it's crystal clear. Maybe someone who you experienced abuse at the hand of, or someone who demeaned you or hurt you in the past. Sometimes even more clearly, someone who hurt someone you love. For many of us, you don't have to look too far to imagine the enemy. So too often, we can become our own worst enemy. As we envision enemies in whatever form they come to us or don't, we ask of this text, why does Jesus go the extra mile here to say, love your enemy? Wouldn't it be enough for Luke's version of the golden rule in verse 35 to emerge, do to others as you would have them do to you? Isn't the call to love your enemy, call to love your neighbor enough? We all know how hard that is. We also know how much potential is in it. If I love my neighbor, then I might have to get to know my neighbor. And if working together as known people across our differences, we might construct something new together, something transformative together. But Jesus goes the extra mile here and calls us to love the enemies. Is it for rhetorical impact or dramatic flair? Or is he going too far, in fact? Is he crossing into the world of re-traumatization of survivors and asking them to love their abusers? Is Jesus compromised here? And instead, if Jesus were to compromise here and to say instead, strive to reconcile with your enemy, we might all give a more resounding amen. One need look no further than the power of the Mandelas of our world who forgive enemies through truth and reconciliation. The Center for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada trying to reconcile Indigenous communities that experienced abuse in schools for 150 years. Or the power behind the work of the Parents Circle, that group of Israeli and Palestinian bereaved parents for peace that both Julie and Tom Reed encountered this past summer in the Holy Lands. Or the iconic Germans and British soldiers singing Silent Night during that World War I Christmas truth. These stories of reconciling enemies are so powerful, and we need to be reminded of them time and time again. Reconciling, yes, but loving enemies seems a whole different game. Jesus, of course, is not the first one here to call humanity to such a high standard. A Babylonian text some 2,000 years before Jesus went this way: "Do not return evil to your adversary, requite with kindness the one who does evil to you. Maintain justice for your enemy, be friendly to your enemy." And of course, the Hebrew Bible is replete with references to loving those who are different, the strangers, the outsiders. And it comes up with gems like this in Exodus: "If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey wanders away, you shall surely return it to them." Scholars agree that the early church was deeply influenced by first century Greek ethical thought, especially the school of the Stoics, Seneca being a leading voice in that time, who was a contemporary with Jesus. Seneca, who wrote, "We shall never cease to work for the common good, to help each other all, to give aid even to our enemies when our hand is feeble with age." So Jesus did not first come up with this line, but in repeating these ancient ideas, perhaps unpopular even at the time, Jesus is repurposing them within the heart of a new emergent movement, the early church, called to speak of God's love in a new way. And so no doubt got the attention of the early Lucan community, and no doubt should get ours as well. The word Jesus uses here for love of enemies is, of course, agape, far more deeply encompassing than romantic love or friendship, one that speaks of a wholeheartedness and an unreserved desire for the well-being of another. Agape is without conditions. Agape is different from our normal tit-for-tat equivalent retaliation that loves those who love us and ignores those who ignore us. Agape, your enemy, is a desire for their restoration, their wholeness, independent of any particular fondness or support of their position or sanctioning of their behavior. It is no small task. If we agape our enemies, we still may speak out in opposition to their perspective. If one of your enemies, for instance, is the fossil fuel empire, just saying, an agape love may look like civil disobedience to shut down climate-altering dirty pipelines, like the wonderful 4 necessity valve-turning Catholic workers who were arrested a few weeks ago in Minnesota. Their hope was not to shame or condemn these companies, but to convince them to turn around, to convert away from fossil fuels to become true alternative energy companies. Such an agape love will express opposition in nonviolent ways, but always aim away from shame toward restoration. Again, easy to say, so hard to enact. As we look around our world today, it's so easy to see examples of the word enemy. I noticed on the front page of the New York Times yesterday, I actually saw a physical copy. The newspaper that was recently dubbed the enemy of the people by the occupier in the White House shows a kid's drawing from a rehabilitation center for children who were forced to be soldiers in Yemen. It's titled "Dispatches in Crayon from a War Zone," and shows stick-figure kids shooting at each other with machine guns. I, of course, just named the occupier in the White House, alerting perhaps some of us. But again, the barrage of enemy speak that has come from our highest leadership in our land against journalists, against non-white immigrants, against virtually anyone who disagrees with mandates coming from on high. Such enemy speak has now led to the declaration of a national emergency, not against climate change or mass incarceration or the wealth gap, or against white nationalist supremacy, but against people of color who are fleeing political instability and economic dislocation sparked by our own corrupt U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. Agapeing such enemy speak is tough stuff in our world today, but it is indeed sacred stuff that Jesus calls us into. In preparing for today's worship service and reading various commentaries and reflections, I have been struck with how differently people react to the enjoinder to love our enemies based on lived experience and based on comparative privilege. I'm struck with how I encounter this text from a place of relative comfort and security, signs of my cisgendered binary male U.S. Protestant with loads of white privileged self. Beyond some deeply troubling political realities that concern me, I find it hard to visualize personal enemies because I have not experienced the often daily oppression, sexual violence, and unreported literal or emotional strikes to the cheek that are too often experienced by people of color, by gender non-conforming siblings, and by women. So I turn to learn from those who have experienced life differently than I have, including how our former moderator of our Presbyterian Church and current coordinator of racial and intercultural justice, Reverend T. Denise Anderson, experiences this text as deeply challenging and often problematic. She makes the point that the enemy can often be the way in which these verses are used or misused. She quotes Zora Neale Hurston, "If you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it." She goes on, such verses have often encouraged people to stay silent about their pain. They've often been employed to silence the victimized so that others are not discomforted or inconvenienced by their difficult stories. And more nefariously, we have used Jesus' words here to actively encourage vulnerable people to stay in abusive environments and relationships. Such misuses of these verses, rather than outright hostility from avowed enemies, present the biggest threat to the church, truly embracing its call to justice and genuine siblinghood. Reverend Anderson's unease with how these verses call us to be also might explain the experience of the early church. You remember the backdrop of this entire Luke-Acts narrative written to the most excellent Theophilus. At some point in the 1st century CE, towards the end of it, was a period of time where instability and fear ruled the day. The church was still small, it was emerging, and it was beginning to be seen in some lights by the Roman Empire as a threat. References to enemies would have been easy for the Lucan community to immediately visualize. The lines about being struck on the cheek and having your coat taken away would have immediately been seen as overt references to the common Roman military practices of taking advantage of the poor. Liberation theologians like Leonardo Boff and Walter Wink's Third Way help us to understand these verses not as supportive of victimization or passive acceptance of abuse, but as deeply empowering resistance. Wink explains that both the turning of the cheek and the giving of your tunic to expose one's nakedness were bold acts of resistance, meant to expose the injustices of those who would oppress. Such a third way is also a Gandhian principle of nonviolent action, that of non-cooperation with everything humiliating. Friends, these are difficult verses, but if we listen to perspectives beyond our own interpreting them, we might learn a new point of view. And we might place ourselves, even in the text, in a new way. What if we were the ones who were repeatedly striking others' cheeks? What if we were the ones taking their coats, even without knowing it? What if we have met the enemy, and the enemy is us? Friends, if we forget the unconditional agape love of God, we might forget and miss the main point of such texts. And if we don't listen to the voices that are different than our own, we might remind ourselves, and we might forget to remind ourselves of the agency that is in all. Reverend Anderson goes on to say, even at the receiving end of another's bad behavior, I can control my own response. I have agency. Dr. King and so many others spoke of that. No one can take away one's dignity and one's response in the light of the actions of those we see as our enemies. So in today's world of Me Too and mass shootings and sexual abuse scandals rocking the Catholic Church and the Southern Baptist Convention, what can we say about enemies and forgiveness? Jesus links them here at the end of this text. And so we listen to people like Daniel Berrigan, who wrote, "Love your enemies, a strange command when you think of it, Jesus. Love and then enemies, the two cannot coexist. They are like fire and ice in the hand. The fire melts the ice, or the ice extinguishes the fire. The fire wins out, at least in this gospel text. The verb love transforms the noun enemies. The enemy is reborn by the power of love. Astonishing. Now the enemy is a former enemy and the present friend, brother, sister, lover, even. Talk about rebirth. Love you the enemy, and lo, the enemy vanishes. where he stood. Also, it is not the opponent who undergoes a damp, dazzling transformation, but myself as well, who against all expectation has learned love in place of hatred, who has once been struck in the same plight as my enemy. Today we have made a frozen mirror image, awful, redundant, implacable. I was the enemy of my enemy. Berrigan reminds us that the love of enemy is the call to love of self. It is the call to being unbound by the ways of violence and hatred. And so again, we turn to another voice that is far different than my own. Liberation theologian, womanist, I would call Lutheran minister Nadia Bolz-Weber, who says this about reconciliation, forgiveness, and hatred. Maybe retaliation or holding on to anger about the harm done to me doesn't actually combat evil. Maybe it feeds it. Because in the end, if we're not careful, we can absorb the worst of our enemy and at some level start to become them. So what if forgiveness, rather than being a pansy way to say it's okay, is actually a way of wielding bolt cutters and snapping the chains that link us? What if it's saying, what you did to me was not okay, and I refuse being connected to it anymore? Forgiveness is about being a freedom fighter, and free people are dangerous people. Free people aren't controlled by the past. Free people laugh more than others. Free people see beauty where others do not. Free people are not easily offended. Free people are afraid to speak the truth to stupid. And free people are not chained to resentment. That's worth fighting for. Indeed, Reverend Bolz-Weber, fighting to free ourselves from hatred and abuse is worth the fight. It's worth running out from behind the crumbling snow fort walls in what might seem like hopeless last stands, but with bravery in our hearts to strive to see the McCarthy brothers of the world not as enemies, but as children of God in as much need for love as ourselves. And soon the melting away of our useless fistfuls of snowballs become replaced with the unconditional love of God. Free people of God, loved people of God, let us be brave and let us love in return. Amen.